Chapter 11. The Erstwhile Baron. The first Baroness of Febdash, my mother, came from an overpopulated terrestrial world named D. Laplance. Anyways, for family reasons, she had to choose between immigrating to an emptier world or becoming an imperial citizen. He had been given a meal of spicy chicken stew and assorted fresh vegetables. Not only was the portion far too generous for one serving, it was also delicious. The Ov liked their food mild. He'd thought that it was perhaps due to their taste buds differing, but they were actually the same as their ancestors. It was simply a cultural quirk of theirs to prefer bland-tasting food. Jinto had heard theories that the Ov simply mistook thin flavors for elegance. This stew had gone a tad overboard with the spiciness, but compared to the meals he'd been provided on the Gosloth, at least it tasted like something, so Jinto liked it. However, he couldn't just relax and savor the flavor. Pecking at his stew disinterestedly, he gave his full attention to the old man as he recounted the history of the Febdash estate. So, she picked the imperial citizen path. And the quickest way to become one was to volunteer for the Star Forces. So she decided to be a Sosh in the Bondeb. You know that department, don't ya, boy? Yeah, Jinto nodded. It's a technical department that services weapons, right? It sure is. She met my father in the military and gave birth to me on land. Not out of wedlock, mind you, I gathered. Then she got appraised as a real talent and managed to get into a Kenrufazer Robone, Academy for Arms Manufacture. Do you know that kind of school? Yeah, I did some research when looking into schools for myself. It's a school for weapon engineers. That's right. When she graduated, she transferred to the Fazia Robone, Arms Department, and became a star pilot. If she'd stayed a Sosh, all she would have gotten after many years of service was a gentry class rank. She did pretty good for herself, wouldn't you say? Guess so. Not that he had any choice but to agree, with the old man staring at him like that. Seems she'd become estranged from my father around that time. So I dunno what he looks like. But that ain't so rare among the Ov, you know. Mom did even better from that point on. She was nothing special as a Fazia engineer, but she was great at roping people into things. A natural leader, she was. That's what got her so many promotions. She made it all the way to Spinufazer, Engineering Admiral, and Sef Phobot Menyot, Director General of Fleet Administration. Wow. Right? The Empire compensates the service of admirals with noble ranks, and they gave her this blue star here. Jinto's mouth was full of vegetables, so all he could do to confirm he was still listening was nod. Anyways, that's why I'm still just a lander genetically. I hated that when I was a lad, but I don't really care anymore. Honestly, now that I'm this age, I don't know what I'd even do with a younger body. And I don't know why the Ovd renounced their right to die by aging. Though I'm sure this is all gobbledygook to a youngster like you. Well, I can't say I'd mind living life without aging. You say that now, but if you ask me, the soul and the body oughta age in tandem. But never mind that. Long story short, they let me apply to an academy 'cause Mom was gentry. But I ain't got any frocross, so I couldn't be a Lodir Garer, flight staff star pilot, or as they'd say, a Lodir Nokta, a real star pilot. So, I enrolled in a Kenrufazerhar, shipbuilding academy. You know what that is? Yeah, I looked into that too. I just don't think I'm cut out for design or engineering. There were 4 main streams in technological careers. There was the arms department, where staff devised weapons, the Fazia Har, shipbuilding department, where they designed hulls, the Fazia Ser, engine department, where they formulated machines, and the Fazia Datio Krier, photonics department, where they dealt with computing crystals. Luckily, I was able to become a Lodir Fazerhar, shipbuilding star pilot. When Mom got her noble rank in territory, she was able to make full use of her technical know-how. And that'll be the crux of the plan. Wait, what? Jinto didn't quite follow, but he sensed that the old man was finally verging on something juicy. I'm talking about our insidious plot to sneak you out right from under my son's nose. You didn't forget, did ya? How could I? It's all I've been thinking about. So you didn't listen to a word I said. Jinto's face flushed red. He'd hit the bullseye. It's fine, said the former Baron, waving his hand. It's just been so long since I've talked to anybody. Forgive my inane babbling. It wasn't inane babble. It was all very interesting. Come now, boy. You seem like an alright kid, but now's the time for you to learn that blatant ego salving's only gonna hurt people. Sorry. Don't fret it. In any case, I'm gonna explain it to you in detail. First of all, think of the similarities between ships and orbital estates. Estates are just ships without engines, ain't they? And I was the one who planned out this barony's estate. Thanks to my designer's privileges, I never had to hand it over to him. That numbskull was so quick to lock me up he forgot to shake me down for it beforehand. All I gotta do is say the Seshoth password, and this whole mansion's EHF, computing crystal net, will submit to me. If I can just get near a terminal, it'll be child's play to turn the tables and imprison my little son of the year. Then why? Why did I content myself with captivity? Tell me, boy, where would I go exactly? If I broke out of the estate, all that'd await me is a 3-degree Kelvin void. Sides, all the servants I'd gotten to know back in the day VE all been dismissed. Now they're all hires tailored to his tastes. So it's understandable why I'm not so gung-ho about escape, ain't it? But couldn't you've called for help? The Empire doesn't meddle in noble family affairs. If you're a noble, then you ought to remember that for the future. I'll have you know I like this life of mine, too. I ain't got anything to do on the outside. Meeting up with old friends wouldn't go so well, since I've aged and they haven't. It'd make me resent how I'm the only who had to. Excuse me, but didn't you just say that the soul and the body should age in tandem? You ain't ever heard of sour grapes, boy? Oh, I'm familiar. Then that ought to say it all. Well, if you're okay with it, then, he believed the former Baron overall, though doubt remained. Are you sure the Baron hasn't changed that password? Nope, he replied breezily. I ain't sure, but sometimes you've just gotta throw the dice. Otherwise life gets real boring. That's the thing I hate the most about my life here, nobody to lay wagers with. I'm not a big fan of gambling, said Jinto. Ever since that fateful day 7 years prior, Jinto had a feeling that destiny didn't much like him. And he wasn't about to commend his life to a force with whom he didn't get along. You're probably better off that way, but we're running good odds here. The password is burned in on a molecular level. As long as he hasn't changed all of the computing crystals, he can't have changed the password. If you say so. But his misgivings weren't quite cleared yet. There was no guarantee that he hadn't, in fact, replaced them. Believe in me, boy. Bet on me. Now, I ain't averse to helping ya so I can kill some time, but first I gotta hear what's got ya in this tizzy. What did you come here for, and how'd you end up in this dump with me? So Jinto filled him in. About how he'd been accepted into a quartermaster's academy. How he'd boarded the patrol ship Gosloth to get to the capital, to Lokvakar. How they'd crossed paths with a fleet of likely enemy space-time bubbles. How he'd been able to escape using the connecting vessel that Leifir was piloting. How they'd come to the Febdash Barony for a refueling pit stop. And you know the rest. So you're saying the girl you mentioned before is a royal princess? Yep, he nodded reluctantly. Hooey. The old man grinned. So that's what's been going on out there since I retired. This is a real doozy, let me tell ya. If my dead mother caught wind of this, she'd be head over heels. A royal princess in our home. Having even just you over, the noble prince of a Khaundam, is downright extravagant. It's raised the status of my family name. You can cut the wisecracks now, said Jinto, peeved. So, are you gonna help me? Course, boy. I just need to help you get back to the skies on the connecting vessel with the royal princess, right? After getting it refueled, yeah. Right, course. Can't forget the refueling bit. Might as well get you two some food to carry with you while we're at it, too. That'd be great, if you can. Thank you. I was getting tired of one ear, combat rations. They're as bland as everything else the Avit. But would you be able to? I think so. There's just one problem. What? Remember what I said about needing a terminal? Well, my son's vaguely aware I'd find some use in one, so there ain't any in this section. You can't be serious, he said dejectedly. What did you expect? I'd just stroll right up to a terminal so you and your girlfriend could escape hand in hand, just like that? Life ain't that easy. Leifir's not my girlfriend, Jinto pointed out. Don't dwell on it, I was just embellishing, that's all. Okay, whatever. How do we get to a terminal? We just need to slip out of here first. How? That's what we need to figure out together. Otherwise our insidious plan ain't going anywhere, boy. Plus, this is your chance to impress your lady friend. Speaking of which. What? You sure you ain't a couple? I'm sure. It was a rather unfortunate fact, but a fact all the same. Yet here you are, calling a royal princess by her given name. Not many in the Empire who can get away with that, you know. Or do you just call her by name when she's not around? 'Cause then I'd have to amend my evaluation of you. No, Jinto hemmed and hawed. I do address her by name. Then. But only because of my own ignorance and a boatload of luck. Going into it any further would take too long. I'd be boring you to tears. Oh no, I'd love to have a listen, but I can tell you're not in the mood to divulge. Not really, no. Sorry. There's no time to waste. It sucks, but what can you do? And I thought I'd be able to cast my wretch of a son in the role of a corrupt noble making advances on another man's girl. The perfect, hoggish role for that faux sophisticate. In reality, the Baron of Febdash did not nurse any such feelings toward Leifir. And Leifir, for her part, wasn't the type to be crushing on anyone at the moment, at least not consciously. No potential for some illicit affair. Typically, the Baron took a handful of his favorite servants to his bedchambers, but tonight he retired alone. He had much to ruminate on. He poured some apple cider from the Dryohainu Semliuk, Count Alm of Semliush, into his cup of amethyst and downed it. His heart was wavering. He couldn't be sure that he'd made the right call. His ambition was to create his own kingdom. The kingdom he sought to erect wouldn't be a large enough power to resist the Empire, for though he did tend to overestimate his own talents, he was no madman. In terms of scale, he was fine with his barony remaining this size. However, the man was a prisoner of his own inferiority complex within the prism of the Empire's aristocracy. He was, at present, a mere baron, and the history of his family line was shorter than that of many gentry. That is why he didn't much care for visits to the capital. His house's lack of history assaulted him most when he was among other Ovs. But here, in his domain, he was the only Ov around. He didn't consider his father to be a true Ov, and even if he did, nothing would have changed. On this tiny world, he was the ruler, the subduer. So long as he didn't venture out of his comfort zone, he could delude himself into thinking he was the king of an independent monarchy. He could rule with impunity. The second he'd intercepted the communication between Leifir and the flight control officer, he feared he'd lose his little kingdom. The enemy could be naught but the Four Nations Alliance. His domain didn't get much by way of information, but it was enough to come to that conclusion. Would the FNA recognize the autonomy of his barony? No, of course not. Then what could he do? All he could hope for, the Baron thought after some moments of intense consternation, was that the FNA ignored the barony altogether. To have that happen, he'd need to avoid any unnecessary activity. He refused to allow any entry into flat space through the Febdash gate. He'd explained as much to Leifir. He was well aware, of course, that flat space entry from the Febdash gate was not, in fact, all that likely to arouse the attention of the enemy. As such, the first plan that flitted through his mind was to refuel them as quickly as possible and then promptly jettison all the small ships that could signpost their existence. That would have been the course of action that invited the least risk. But that was when a much less noble-minded thought burrowed into his heart. What if the enemy already had the barony in its sights? If they demanded he provide them aid, he would comply without a second thought. The barony had no military power, so resistance was futile. He would give them as much fuel as they wanted, if that would keep his kingdom intact. But perhaps the enemy wasn't interested in his aid. There was the worryingly distinct possibility that they simply seized the antimatter fuel factories and the other facilities by force. That said, wouldn't they also be interested in the Empress's granddaughter? She'd have no value as a hostage, given the responsibilities incumbent upon the Empress, but maybe the enemy didn't know that. He could use her as a pawn. He could ensure the preservation of his star fief and hand her over to them. He'd prolong negotiations for as long as possible, but not out of any hesitation to assist the enemy. On the contrary, he'd turn the barony of Febdash into a strategic base for the FNA. If it turned into an important resupplying station for them, he'd be mostly safe. After all, if they took over its operations by force, he was prepared to commit suicide and take the entire domain out with him. Leifir was a bird who'd unwittingly flown into his cage, and he'd use her as collateral. And what if his link to the Empire was severed, and the enemy never came to his doorstep? That would be ideal, for then he would truly become this small world's absolute ruler. It mattered not that he'd have only his 50 servants as subjects, nor that he'd only have access to a limited variety of meat and hydroponic produce. He could even bear to go without his favorite Semlyish sourced apple cider. All he desired was to be the one with all the power in his domain. He pictured himself reigning over a world. A small world, yes, but a whole world. And in that world would be Leifir. If all communication with the Empire ceased, then he would have no cause to feel inferior next to the royal princess. She would have no authority here. He'd chosen only the most meek and submissive of women as his servant staff, and they revered him as a god. If the princess and the baron ever issued contradictory orders, he knew his servants would follow his without question. In truth, the baron had never associated himself with women. In places like the Lokfakar and within the military, he'd become acquainted with a number of them, but he was always nervous around them. Perhaps as a consequence of that, he would at times indulge in perversion and have one or more servants dye their hair blue and don the garb of an noble. The garments and jewelry he'd collected to that end happened to come in handy for the princess's arrival. But whenever he used them for their intended purpose, it always ended in disappointment. Their looks, their bodies and faces, he could bear. Due to his overly particular tastes, there were women even among the of whom he found difficult to call attractive. The real problem was on the inside. They were too humble, too modest. Nothing at all like an of. To be honest, he'd nearly forgotten what of women were like until Leifir confronted him. He smiled as he poured himself more apple cider. I just spoke my mind like a true of, and to a royal princess at that. Being in the safety of his own castle gave him that sense of security. It would have been unthinkable in the social setting of Lokfakar. He considered it a dry run for the kingdom to come. And my kingdom will need successors to the throne, won't it? He thought drunkenly. This territory had many females, as there were no male servants. They were, however, lander women. There was extremely little chance a baby would be born to an of like him and a lander woman without genetic modification. Even if she conceived, it would probably be marred by fatal congenital defects. Of course, the empire hosted many medical institutions that practiced genetic modification. He himself was born of an of and a lander, made genetically 100% off through that process. But here in the barony of Febdash, no such facilities or equipment existed. And Leifir was an of, with whom he could not take issue. Biologically speaking, he would have no trouble siring heirs through her. Natural delivery among the of came with its share of dangers, as their race was an unnatural one, but those risks weren't so high as to warrant avoiding at all costs. The baron had read some papers about the likelihood of congenital diseases among naturally birthed of infants. According to that reputable research, the chances of it causing some grave ailment were about 1 in 50. Those were fairly favorable odds. Yes, I shall spread my seed through a royal princess. His delusions were swelling without end. It was then that the baron began, perhaps, to harbor feelings for Leifir, though naturally, it didn't have to be her specifically. Any genetically of woman would suffice. He couldn't find fault with Leifir's beauty, apart from how she was still too young and childlike to have fully blossomed. Moreover, it would take quite some time for her to come of age. Lastly, their personalities weren't exactly a match. But those were all considerations for the far future. For all he knew, the Empire could recover this land at any moment. That was the reason he was treating Leifir courteously, at least on the surface. It was in case communications with the center of the Empire ever resumed. Of course, he couldn't be said to have treated that surface rat of a noble prince with much courtesy. But he hadn't committed any crimes against him. He was lodging with his own father. He had a raft of defenses he could deploy. As for the connecting vessel the two had ridden here, he sensed it could prove irksome to him, so he wanted to destroy it, but he decided against it for the time being on the grounds that that would be difficult to explain away to the Empire. If and when he became certain that the Empire wasn't coming back, he would deal with it as he pleased. And then, the royal princess would be much easier to handle. Even the boy might be of use to him. The seed of a lander was needed to give rise to the next generation of servants. The Baron's uncertainty slipped away with each new ounce of alcohol that numbed his brain cells. He'd thought of every possible contingency, he assured himself. Even if his plans weren't perfect, this was the best he could come up with given the situation. Exhilarated, the Baron gulped down the rest of his apple cider and laid himself down to sleep. The phone chose that moment to ring. What? If this was over some nonsense, they would have to prepare themselves for a dressing down. This is Greta, calling from the homemaker's office. I apologize for disturbing you at this late hour, but someone has infiltrated the connecting vessel. What should we do? The Baron vaulted out of bed. It seemed this bird was not resigned to languishing in her cage. He had made an error in his calculations. The Baron's breathtaking handsomeness was something landers on terrestrial worlds rarely ever saw, and it stirred up the servants' loyalty to him whether they liked it or not. These were women who longed after the image of the Baron, to the point of worshipping at his altar. Time spent alongside the Baron was like an intoxicating drug that they competed amongst each other to obtain. They even saw the unreasonable verbal abuse and lashes of the whip as the sweetest of gifts, so long as they were doled out by the Baron. If they didn't, they would not be qualified to be servants of the Feb-barony. However, he forgot to account for the fact that those ravishing looks fit for a demigod were not unique to him. Ravishing beauty was the standard among the kin of the stars, not the exception. There were certainly those servants that felt loyal to the Baron as a person. These were the lovers he took with him to bed every night. But more than half of them were not so keen on the man as an individual. Instead, they were fascinated by the Av as a race. They nearly regarded the Av world as on par with a heavenly realm, but they knew that the Baron was not so high in the ranks of Av nobility. Selnai was one of those women. Unbeknownst to the Baron, she made a hobby of gazing at holograms of nobles. She felt no attraction to women whatsoever, but she couldn't help but admire the Av royal princess before her eyes. She herself was astounded that she was able to carry on speaking as normal without turning into a nervous wreck in her presence. It was probably because it hadn't yet hit her that all of this was real. Selnai was grateful to the Baron. He'd given her a place within the heavenly realm of her dreams, the world of the Av, even if it was a remote region. And she had spent a long time in the barony, long enough to come to believe in her bones that her lord's orders were absolute. But Leifir's words carried a certain compelling force that electrified her soul. This was the gorgeous and elegant of who could one day become a commander, the commander. She felt like she was being pulled in both directions and splitting at the seams, but the thought that she was assisting a royal princess during her time of need filled her with a dizzying, blissful rush that was the ultimate deciding factor. She didn't ask Leifir anything else. She just guided her to the departure and arrival hall and waited faithfully for her new mistress in front of the door to the elevator tube. At last, Leifir descended to her floor. The thigh area of her long robe was bulging oddly. Filartner, she said, kneeling. Gossasek, servant, Selnai, said Leifir. I want you to take me to where Jinto is. That, or bring him to me. Can you do that for me? Jinto? Selnai didn't recall the name. Of whom do you speak? My companion. Yarluk Dryor Hader. He's being held captive. You've seen him before. Upon hearing the title Yarluk Dryor, or Noble Prince of a Khaundam, she pictured a sophisticated blue-haired Av, only to be disappointed. She meant the lander boy who was wearing noble garb. You mean him, Your Highness. Do you know where he's being held? I'm terribly sorry, but there's nothing to be afraid of. The royal princess's voice was tinged with irritation for some reason. I'm not worthy. You do know where the former baron is being held, don't you? My lord's father, said Selnai dismissively. That man was Av as a matter of social standing, but he wasn't really an Av. So, he was hiding himself in shame. That man is not being held captive. He's holed up in his retirement. Then why can't I contact him? Now that she mentioned it, that was strange. Since she'd never tried contacting him even once, she hadn't realized it was impossible to do so. I don't care whether he's imprisoned or just retired. I just know that Jinto's with him. So please, lead him out for me. She shrank. I really must apologize, but that's not possible. Because the Baron's forbidden it? Yes, but not only that. The truth is, without my lord's permission, there's no entry there. So it's locked out. Yes, your highness. Can you think of any way to contact him? I believe he can be contacted through the telephone in the homemaker's office, but only a select few servants are allowed to enter. Do you think it's possible to sneak in without being seen? I'm sorry, it's not feasible. There were always a few servants in the office. Then we must seize control of it, you and I. Leifir pulled a gun from her long robe sleeve and proffered it. Do you know how to use one? No, I've never used one, so Selnai could scarcely believe how much faith the princess was putting in her. It's simple. Leifir pulled the other gun from her sash and taught her how to operate it. Understood, your highness. It really was simple. She had but to make sure the safety was released, train the muzzle on her mark, and squeeze the trigger. Let's go. The princess beat a quick path as she dashed forward. There's no time to lose. Yes, your highness. Selnai rushed to catch up. Since there were several doors that needed opening on the way to the homemaker's office, Selnai led the way. But when they reached the first door, Selnai froze. I'm mutinying against my lord. She trembled with fear. Drawn in by the princess's jaunty demeanor, she hadn't given her actions much thought, but now she realized that what she was trying to do, no, what she was already doing, was treason. She emitted her Crest from her wrist computer and unlocked the door. Open, she said, voice shaking. Then she looked back. Fielartner. What is it? Leifir had already walked ahead of her. Selnai jogged after her. I have a request. Speak it. Since I've betrayed my lord, I can no longer remain in this barony. I beg of you, your highness, please take me on as one of your servants. Leifir looked behind her at Selnai and blinked. Selnai feared she'd asked too much of her. Yes, of course, said Leifir. But you'd be my only servant. But that can't be. She couldn't believe that a member of the imperial family didn't have a single servant at her beck and call. There are many servants at the royal household of Cryeb, she clarified. It's my father who has authority over them, but I'm sure he'll understand your situation. Is your father His Majesty, the King of Cryeb? Yes, Leifir replied briskly. The reality before her, that she was within reach of a girl with regal blood seeped in, and she was filled with renewed awe. I have to warn you, you won't be able to use your talents there. You're an antimatter fuel tank technician, aren't you? I'm so honored you remembered. She'd remembered not only her name, but even her occupation. She hadn't thought it possible. Selnai was so moved that tears threatened to burst forth. Stop that, said Leifir, annoyed. Stop what, your highness? She grew flustered, worried she'd fallen from the princess's graces. Never mind, she said, giving up. In any case, wouldn't you be better suited somewhere you could apply those skills? I'm pleased beyond words that your highness would see after the future of a drudge like me. But I have no desire to stay here. Yes, I know, the princess nodded. Let's just get you out of here. I can't promise you'll be able to work with my family, however. Your kind words are more than enough. She would likely be able to at least take her to the capital, Lokvakar. Another door. The homemaker's office was close now. Selnai opened it, mind racing. While a minor episode in the life Leifir would go on to lead, it would be an incident of great weight in the history of this barony.